Hello and welcome to this Monday's weekly market briefing. We've got a lot to talk about, but firstly, Biden says Iran-backed militants killed 3 US servicemen in drone attack, as well as that Chinese regulators curb short selling as market downturn deepens, as well as that US urges China to deter Iran-backed Houthis in back channel meeting. We've got lots to talk about on the charts also, with lots happening on the economic calendar, but we'll come to that near the end, so make sure you stay around so you can see that. Before we get straight into it, make sure to subscribe. But the first article to talk about, of course, is with Biden and the Iranian-backed militants. Now, Biden reported that 3 US soldiers were killed in a drone attack by Iranian militias yesterday, and this marks the first US deaths, in the Middle East following the October the 7th attacks. Now, of course, we've been covering basically the whole list of kind of conflicts and escalations and clashes that we've seen following the October the 7th terrorist attack by Hamas militants in Israel, and since then we have seen, of course, a great deal of escalations, whether that be Israel's invasion into Gaza, or Hezbollah's activity on the northern border along with Lebanon and Israel, or even the Syrian and Iraqi militia groups which have been attacking Israel and US service bases, such as this one in that we're talking about now, or even probably more importantly in regards to the US, the attacks that we have seen in relation to the Houthis based in Yemen firing missiles and drones at US and UK warships, as well as commercial vessels as well, which have been sailing through the Gulf of Aden and Red Sea. And this, as a result of course, has dramatically affected world trade and led the US and UK to engage in joint strikes against Houthi militants and military infrastructure in Yemen. And so, there's been a great deal of escalation essentially since that October the 7th attack. And this marks a serious escalation, as ultimately, whilst, warships within the Gulf of Aden and Red Sea owned by the US have been targeted by the Houthi militants, using missiles and drones, ultimately, none of those attacks have actually, resulted in US servicemen dying in any way. And ultimately, whilst we have seen commercial vessels on fire, we've seen, commercial vessels damaged, even the crew of many ships taken hostage. Ultimately, we haven't yet seen US soldiers die, and therefore, understanding the ramifications of this, even though it might only be a small number of individuals which have passed away, sadly, ultimately the result of this could be catastrophic for certainly those militia groups. But as a result, the Middle East as a whole, if this does, of course, escalate into a regional conflict, which we've been constantly kind of warning of and talking about, ultimately because of the fact that how this could very easily, instantly pull in Hezbollah onto the northern border of Israel and see Hezbollah attack, or vice versa. Ultimately, because Hezbollah has vowed support for Hamas, and many of these groups within Iraq and Syria, which have been attacking US personnel, have ultimately been under the umbrella group of Hezbollah's network, which of course is funded and run basically by Iran. And so, kind of understanding where all of this interlinks, you can then quite quickly build a very clear picture to a small escalation such as this could definitely turn into one which is more regional. And we've even seen issues beginning to arise in places like Pakistan, Iran, and that sort of thing, where we have seen, counter strikes against their territories, even though they weren't targeting each other's military infrastructure. We were seeing kind of attacks take place through strikes on certain terrorist infrastructure in either or's country. And this kind of marked another escalation where we were like, is Pakistan now going to somehow get involved in this as well? Ultimately, we haven't seen that, but ultimately we're just seeing more and more of these kind of escalations, which are very worrying to say the least in regards to the Middle East. And so ultimately, as we do go into this election year, understanding what's going on as well in relation to the Middle East and possible regional war is just so important. Let alone, talking about how this kind of escalation or regional war could massively affect oil prices, as we've spoken about before, where we mentioned that if Saudi Arabia does get pulled into a war and other parties within the Middle East also join up, we could likely see, a full or complete kind of loss in exports from such countries, especially Saudi Arabia, which as a result is expected to drive oil to the price of $150 a barrel, which is very high compared to the current prices around $80 a barrel. So just to put that into perspective, that would be massively affecting US inflation as well as global inflation, and so that's the key worry really, and that's why it's so important to understand what's going on in the Middle East, with the strike on the US military base bringing a serious escalation to the region. Biden responded saying the US would hold those responsible to account soon. The risk of this, of course, being that this could, of course, drag the US further into a regional conflict. This all follows US strikes in Yemen against the Shia militia group of the Houthis, which have been targeting civilian commercial vessels in the Red Sea with missiles and drones. The attack by the Shia militia group, however, also injured 25 other soldiers, with the attack occurring in a military base in Jordan near the Syrian border. The attack reportedly was carried out by a new umbrella Shia militia group based in Iraq. Pardon me. The group called the IRI has claimed the attacks are in support of Hamas fighting in Gaza. Previous attacks by the IRI on US bases have led to the US doing counterstrikes on the IRI's facilities as well. It's a bit of an annoying name to pronounce. This has all come whilst the US and UK have conducted joint strikes against the Houthis, and since then, the Houthis, well, before that, of course, the Houthis in the Red Sea have been attacking commercial vessels using drones and missiles in an effort to show support to Hamas, with them beginning the attacks kind of saying we're doing this to shut off Israel supplies, but quite quickly people kind of saw that these attacks were ultimately targeting civilian shipping vessels from nations all around the world that had no relation to Israel really, and so that was the kind of key worry and kind of reference that these attacks are more of just a representation of power, maybe instigated by Iran, rather than them actually being a direct support of Gaza or Hamas. Now, despite all these attacks being funded by Iran, US Joint Chiefs of Staff does not believe that Iran wants a wider regional war where Israel and the US are drawn in against Iran. So that's also something that's maybe important to note, which kind of calms down on those worries of escalation. But definitely keep your eyes on this topic. Very important indeed. Next to talk about is the Chinese stock market, with Chinese regulators curbing short selling. Now, China has officially limited short selling following the stock market sell-off worsening, and this comes as pressure grows for regulators to deal with the issue of a mass stock sell-off. Now, of course, we've kind of been covering the issues in relation to China's economy for quite some time now, with China obviously since emerging out of the kind of period of lockdown, like many economies around the world, has been struggling with the effects of basically shutting down your entire economy, shutting down your exports, shutting down your imports, and shutting down your flows of labor. And since then, therefore, we have seen a large property crisis with many of these housing developers kind of dealing with very serious issues in relation to their debt, and this has been weighing on the Chinese economy as a whole, as many kind of consumers and everyday individuals, their main investment vehicle is their property market, and therefore that having a downturn, that having issues is massively weighing on kind of consumer confidence and support and that kind of thing. And that's been very worrying indeed. And ultimately, recently, we've also been seeing the Chinese stock market take a specific hit. And this is also largely as a result of, the US now having a greater expectation of there being interest rate cuts very soon, which would, of course, bring down the interest rates and allow for US equities to grow further as their debt would be cheaper. But ultimately, this has weighed on China because now many investments are going into US equities instead, and this is following, of course, the US interest rate being high for a very long period of time, which has weighed on the yuan as a currency against the dollar. And so there's many issues then that's been relating to the Chinese stock market, which is why it's so important to understand what's going on with this recent stock sell-off, fueling serious uncertainty over the Chinese economy. Investors will now not be able to lend them out for short selling within a certain period. Chinese Premier Li Qiang last week promised forceful state support for the weak market. The CSI 300 index, however, closed down 0.3% on Friday, with the Hang Seng Enterprises Index down 2%, showing investors still aren't convinced. The CSI 300 fell a total of 11% in 2023, and the Hang Seng Index down 14%, with these figures representing the third year of consecutive declines for the Chinese stock market. This is not the first attempt by regulators to resolve market declines, with Chinese authorities tightening capital outflows and providing private instructions to investors. But ultimately, domestic investors have been hurt massively by the market downturn, with retail investors, who bought up derivatives now being hurt by the losses on the contracts. Keep your eyes on news in relation to China's economy, as well as their stock market, of course, such an important region and nation to understand, and understand what's going on with their economy. Keep your eyes on all of that. Next article to talk about, though, is the US and China, so kind of bringing the two together now, where we are talking about the Houthis once again. Now, the US has now urged for China to leverage its influence with Iran to stop Houthi attacks, and this comes following 2 days of discussions in Thailand between US National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan and Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi. Now, the US will also hold counter-narcotics talks with China this week to help relations. This is all in a continued effort to maintain open lines of communication between the two, with both sides welcoming the recent efforts to stabilize relations, including the resumptions of talks between US and Chinese militaries. Talks are also now expected to begin in spring over the topic of AI, with a bilateral dialogue being established. The urge by the US for China to help stop Houthi attacks comes as both US and UK naval forces defended against and struck Houthi militants over the weekend, with the most serious escalation by the Houthis came following a Houthi strike on a British-owned merchant ship, which caught fire and took 19 hours to extinguish. So serious escalations in the Red Sea, as we've previously talked about. But it's interesting to see how these two powers are now trying to kind of keep their relations somewhat at a good level. Ultimately, they are still in a very, very weak position at the moment, all-time low, but it's interesting to see how they're trying to make sure that they're avoiding conflict at all costs, though. So definitely keep your eyes on topics between in relation to the US and China. That's all to talk about on the articles, though. We've covered a lot so far. Next to talk about, of course, is the charts. As we do enter the new week, we've got lots and lots to talk about. And to begin with, we are on the US 30 in regards to US indices as a whole, of course. Now, it does seem, as we did end off the last week, that price had reacted to that 38.20 through proximity, coming into that key liquidity zone that we had noted as the top of the market, which then provided support for price, and we've seen since price move further to the upside, with price pushing into that level numerous times. But what's interesting to see here is that whilst price has spiked higher, price has not actually closed a candle on the 4 hour above that all-time high previous to the one that we've just seen form. And ultimately, that's interesting because it could also reference that there isn't enough bullish momentum still, with that candle just coming before the one we're looking at right now, representing kind of bearish momentum. And so that's the key worry here, is whether we do actually have this bullish momentum that's needed, as ultimately if we look on the RSI index, we can easily find and note a clear RSI divergence, which would usually reference to us, a bearish signal for price. And this is, whilst, we're making new highs on the RSI, we're making lower highs. And that always kind of represents weakness within the market. Added to that, the fact that we're not representing bullish momentum with a candle closing above the previous high. We could be expecting sell side momentum, but ultimately we are seemingly pushing higher slowly. So definitely keep your eyes on the US 30, a very interesting asset at the moment to note. Next to talk about though is the dollar. And there's not too much to say. However, ultimately, the data that we will be receiving this week makes it very important to keep your eyes on the dollar. So whilst at the moment we're seemingly seeing dollar kind of range around, not find momentum to the upside or the downside following hitting that 50% Fibonacci mark, which lined up with that liquidity level, ultimately we haven't seen any bullish momentum. And therefore, what will be interesting to hear is, how the Fed makes its interest rate decision this week and how that ends up influencing the market. Obviously, the Fed also has a press conference following the decision, and ultimately we are expecting interest rates not to change. So that's not the key thing to note. The key thing to note, however, is what Jerome Powell and other Fed officials do note during the Fed press conference, as here we'll be able to hear the Fed's rhetoric following previous economic data in regards to the US, and this will be shaping, of course, the US monetary policy going forward. And that's why it's so important to understand what the Fed is thinking. Ultimately, depending on those talks, we could see, depending on that rhetoric, we could see dollar make a push to the upside once again, or sell off from where it is at the moment. So in the lead up to those pieces of data that we're getting this week, it's likely that we're going to see market actors kind of find their positions on the high and the low axis in this range or just below and above the range as they kind of hedge their bets and prepare for the news and the data, which of course will induce a lot of volatility. So definitely keep your eyes on the dollar, so important at the moment. Next to talk about is Euro USD. Not too much to say. But it does seem that Euro USD has failed to continue a move to the downside. But once again, because we are getting so much ECB news as well as Fed news, so we're getting Eurozone inflation rate and also the Fed's interest rate decision, it'll be interesting to see how those two pieces of data factor into how the Euro USD moves this week. It'll be very volatile, so keep your eyes on that. Next to talk about is pound yen. Not too much to note. We're still halted. We've continued to halt at this kind of all-time high and this key liquidity zone. Not much momentum being represented, so definitely look out for pound yen as we could see some moves this week. Next to talk about is Bitcoin, which has now reached this key liquidity zone after going through a bit of a retracement. It'll be interesting to see then whether we do react to this zone now. If we draw out the fib, prices just come into contact with that 78.60, so we could definitely see some sell side momentum from this level. Keep your eyes on Bitcoin. Next to talk about is gold. Not too much to note on gold. We have been ranging around recently, but ultimately the news in the Middle East will definitely be driving gold as it is a safe haven asset, so world tensions definitely do play into the way gold moves. As well as that, we're also having, of course, some key data points being released this week, which will definitely be pushing gold as well. So listen out for all of that in regards to gold. Definitely keep your eyes on it. And lastly, to talk about, most importantly, is oil, which largely as a result of strikes in the Red Sea and that targeting of the British merchant vessel which caught on fire, we have seen oil, as a result of other factors as well, push significantly to the upside, which is very interesting to see indeed, as it has represented an extreme amount of bullish momentum coming out of an extremely bearish period. We're now reaching levels not seen since November, or even end November, or even start November. So a very interesting level indeed, and we've broken above that 78.60 as a long-term fib. So definitely we're on the upside move at the moment for oil. Definitely keep your eyes on that. That's all to talk about on the charts though. Lastly, to talk about, of course, is the economic calendar, where we do have lots and lots of very important data coming out this week. So lots to listen out for and trade amongst, basically. So firstly, we will be getting Eurozone, German and Italian GDP growth rate figures, as well as that we're getting US consumer confidence figures, along with Aussie inflation rate figure. And along with that, we'll be getting the Chinese and US manufacturing figure, as well as the German, French and Italian inflation rate. So some very important inflation rate data right there. That's very important to note, of course. As well as that, we'll be getting the German unemployment rate, along with the Fed's interest rate decision and their press conference. So very, very important. I'll be driving the dollar and US equities, along with the Eurozone inflation rate figure, which of course will be pushing the Euro USD and Euro equities. So definitely keep your eyes on that. Lastly, we'll be having the Bank of England's interest rate decision, which will be very interesting to see, as that will be driving the pound either to the upside or the downside, depending on the Bank of England's rhetoric. And then ultimately, finally, we'll be getting US NFP data, which is also very important to note and will be massively affecting perceptions of future Fed policy. So definitely keep your eyes on all this data. We've covered lots in the articles, though, lots on the charts and lots on the economic calendar. Hope you have a great trading day and a good week of this intensive week in relation to trading. That's all from us at Wildwood Capital. Have a great one. See you later. Bye.